So that was unexpected, wasn't it? And not just unexpected. Shocking, audacious, crazy, and spectacular are just some of the adjectives you could use to describe Ukraine's latest gambit, a bold, high-stakes, mechanized assault into Russia. An attack that, according to the Financial Times, now constitutes, quote, the first time Russia has been invaded by foreign troops since the Second World War. This fact alone would make it massive news. But Ukrainian troops didn't just drive across the border, cause some mayhem, and then retreat to their own territory. At the time of writing, a swath of rural Russia now appears to be under Ukrainian occupation. Since this is a fast-moving situation, the figures we're about to give you may have changed by the time you see this. But as of Wednesday, August the 14th, it appears that Kiev's forces have pushed almost 30 kilometers inside Russia on a wide front. Acting governor of the Kursk region, Alexei Smirnov, has claimed 28 villages are under Ukrainian control. Ukraine says it's more like 74. On Monday, Ukraine's top commander, Alexander Syrsky, declared that his army had seized a total of 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. To be clear, the figures here are extremely disputed. With the events so fluid, they're also likely changing from hour to hour. Ukrainian channel Deep State, for example, puts total territory under Kiev's control at a more modest 300 square kilometers. Malcontent News thinks it's more like 769, with another 300 contested. As the Twitter analysis channel WarMapper points out, though, even the lowest of those figures is still more than the amount of land Russia seized in its recent Kharkiv offensive. In fact, the Kursk incursion represents the biggest slice of territory changing hands since the liberation of Kherson in late 2022, or in the words of The Economist, in 7 days, the Ukrainians have seized almost as much territory as Russia has managed at huge cost to take from them since the start of the year, 1,175 square kilometers. Nor is it just the amount of land being seized that's mind-blowing. The FT reports that hundreds of Russian border guards and conscripts have been captured. Over 120,000 residents of Kursk have had to flee, with tens of thousands more escaping neighboring Belgorod Oblast. In some border districts, such as Krasnoyarsk, the entire civilian population has been evacuated. Several other border regions are now under states of emergency. In short, this has been a high-risk, high-impact operation, one which has seen Ukraine not just surprise Russia and thrust the war back into the headlines, but also make some genuine tactical gains. Of these, the biggest so far appears to be the small town of Sudzha. With a pre-war population of 5,000, it's physically the largest settlement Ukraine claims to have occupied, although some open-source analysis suggests its outer districts are still contested. More to the point, it's home to a major Russian pumping station that brings gas from western Siberia and then sends it on across Ukraine to a small number of EU countries, mainly Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria. Here's how Reuters describes its value. About 14.65 billion cubic meters of gas was supplied via Sudzha in 2023, or about half of Russian natural gas exports to Europe. As of early Wednesday, Gazprom reports that this gas is still being pumped. But there's no doubt the control of the pumping station is a win for Ukraine, as is the control of Sudzha's railway station. And yes, we said railway station. Unimportant as a small station might seem, an analyst who tweets under the handle of Intel Shizo has pointed out that, quote, the capture of the railway station may allow Ukrainian intelligence direct access into Russian railway computer systems, schedules, train consists, and internal Russian railway communications from dispatch to defect detectors, which must be causing panic in Russian high command, knowing that the enemy has real-time capacity to view your logistical movements. Of course, these gains, while of concrete benefit to Ukraine, have come at a cost. Although the operation massed air defense and electronic warfare assets before storming the border, Russian aviation and drones have killed scores of Ukrainian troops. The Economist spoke to wounded soldiers involved in the mission who talked about, quote, the demonic buzz of Russia's skies. Exactly how large these casualty numbers are is unknown. With Ukrainians maintaining operational security, the only side giving out estimates is Moscow, which, surprise, surprise, not exactly the most reliable source of information here. Now, we'll circle back later to the potential costs of this mission, as well as the very live debate over the incursion's risk-reward ratio, a debate that will only get more heated as the incursion carries on and Ukrainian ground lines of communication get stretched. For now, though, we simply want to take a moment to sit back and admire the sheer audacity of this gamble, one that, at least for now, has rewritten this year's narrative of the war. The remarkable part is that this isn't even the first incursion onto Russian soil since the beginning of Putin's full-scale invasion. The New York Times has written about how the war's first month witnessed a cross-border helicopter attack carried out by Ukraine. Since then, hundreds of drones have been sent over Russian territory to strike oil refineries and air bases. On the ground, anti-Putin Russian forces, backed by Kiev, staged several cross-border raids, the biggest being in May of 2023 and March of 2024. Still, The assault on Kursk marks the first time official Ukrainian armed forces have attacked into Russian territory en masse. And the fact that they were able to maintain the elements of surprise while doing so is, well, all sorts of remarkable. In their feature on the incursion, the Times talked about how, quoting again, thick summer foliage in the oak and maple forests hid heavy weaponry, ostensible training exercises disguised troop movements, soldiers had fanned out, sleeping in abandoned homes in villages. The quote ends. Senior officers were only told of the impending offensive 3 days beforehand. Rank-and-file troops found out less than 24 hours ahead of the launch. The Financial Times claims that the American and German governments were kept in the dark right until the shooting started. There were likely good reasons for this. In a report on the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, the Royal United Services Institute found that people leaking like a Russian submarine was a factor in that operation's poor performance. Fast forward a year, and Kyiv knows the value of keeping its plans close to its chest. The result was a Russia that was caught completely off guard by the invasion. Demining machines followed by armored vehicles surged forwards in broad daylight at around noon on August the 6th. As an anonymous source told The Economist, quoting, "We sent our most combat-ready units to the weakest point on their border. Russian conscript soldiers faced Ukrainian paratroopers and simply surrendered." These first heady days saw Ukrainian units advancing at rates of 10 kilometers a day, a stunning speed in a war where Russian troops taking a week to advance 6 kilometers towards Pokrovsk is recently considered fast. And speaking of Russian troops, the incursion highlighted an ongoing weakness, one the War on the Rocks podcast noted. When confronted with surprise, the Kremlin's army is often slow to react and disorganized when it finally does so. And that can have consequences. In this case, it led to a situation where a convoy of Russian troops were hit by a HIMARS strike that took out 15 vehicles and may have killed as many as 400 soldiers. As the Telegraph notes, it was likely, quote, one of the largest one-time losses of life since the beginning of the war. The slowness of the response also allowed Ukraine's troops to advance further than would have otherwise been possible. Nor did the Kremlin seem prepared for a wave of supporting strikes that hit places like a vital airbase in nearby Lipetsk Oblast. Australian former General Mick Ryan writes that the strike, quote, destroyed munitions which would almost certainly have been used against the Ukrainian troops. Yet a slow and disorganized response does not equal no response. While the Institute for the Study of War claimed on Tuesday the 13th that, quote, Ukrainian forces appear to be advancing further within Kursk Oblast, by the time of writing, it was beginning to look like the tempo of operations had slowed. That's not to say there was no movement as the Kursk assault entered its second week. Malcontent News summed up info from Ukrainian and Russian mill bloggers by writing that, quote, Deep State showed that Ukrainian forces had entered eastern Koronevo and Rybar reported fightings in Tolpino. Ukrainian forces appear to be attempting to cut off Russian troops. Open source intelligence account Ukraine Control Map, meanwhile, posted on Tuesday that Ukrainian units had advanced a full 20 kilometers towards Giri in Kursk before getting caught in an ambush. However, a general consensus seems to be that Russian reinforcements will shortly start arriving in large numbers, meaning Kyiv's troops will have to solidify their positions. Finnish analyst Emil Kastelmi, for example, writes that the operation has been ongoing for almost a week. During the last days, Ukraine has not made very significant progress, but they have started solidifying their positions in the newly captured areas. While there are still reports of sabotage groups crossing into Russia at other points, the first phase of the operation seems to be coming to an end. And that has left two significant questions. One, has the operation been a success so far? And two, what will the second phase look like? Now let's start with the first one, the question of whether the operation has been a success. It won't surprise you to learn that analysts have wildly different opinions. The positive take is that in bringing the war home to Russia, Ukraine has achieved three important things: boosting morale at home, denting morale in Russia, and changing the perceptions in the West about the course of the war. The morale boost among Ukrainians is obvious. For the whole of 2024, Kyiv's forces have been on the back foot. Even right now, the Russians are grinding onwards towards a likely string of conquests in the Donbass, with Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and New York are likely to fall, and the key logistics hub of Pokrovsk under threat. For 8 months, the overall mood has been one of despair. But this strike into Russia has the power to change all of that. In the same way that Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential race seemed to flip a switch in Democrats from depression to elation, Ukraine going on the offensive has already lifted the national mood. On the other side, the assault has the potential to rattle the Russians. Here's pro-Kremlin analyst Sergei Markov's take, paraphrased by the Washington Post, quoting, he said the attack had triggered intense criticism of Russia's military command, speculating it could lead to changes in leadership. The quote ends. Kiev has been blunt that bringing the cost of war home to ordinary Russians is one of their goals. President Zelensky even declared, "Russia brought war to others, and now it is coming home." Yet perhaps the most important change has come neither in Ukraine nor in Russia, but in Western countries back in Kiev. Amid the near stalemate of recent months, marked only by creeping Russian advances, a narrative has settled over some Western governments that Ukraine cannot fight on. That the only option left is to quietly push Kiev into signing what's likely to be a disadvantageous peace deal. With the Kursk operation, that narrative is, for now at least, as dead as Yevgeny Prigozhin. Here's retired Australian General Mick Ryan again. This Ukrainian operation represents a very significant effort on the part of the Ukrainians to reset the status quo in the war and change narratives about Ukraine's prospects in this war. So far, they seem to have been successful. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham did a joint press conference with Democrat Richard Blumenthal, where he called the assault into Kursk bold, brilliant, beautiful. Likely more useful to Ukraine has been the way Western governments, seemingly impressed by the operation, haven't had a collective meltdown about Kiev using American and German kit in Kursk. Previously, Washington and Berlin feared this would lead to escalation. With US weaponry roaring through the Russian countryside and no nuclear missiles now flying toward Washington, the Ukrainian hope will be that this convinces the West to loosen all rules on striking into Russia. There are other more tangible benefits too. The Financial Times points out that Russia's borders are ridiculously big. So far, Putin has been able to draw all but a small number of forces away from the border regions, since the Kremlin assumed no one would dare attack. Now, as the paper writes, quoting, "It may compel Moscow to redeploy some troops and equipment that could otherwise be used in Ukraine to defend its frontiers against similar incursions elsewhere." Unfortunately, though, the attack has yet to convince Moscow to redeploy its troops from the most important theater of all, the Donbass. One of Ukraine's major goals in invading Kursk was to force Russia to draw its troops from the hottest areas in the front to protect the homeland. So far, in this at least, Kiev's plan has failed. As we write this, Deep State's map is showing Russian units fewer than 15 kilometers from Pokrovsk. Should they reach and take that strategic city, defending the rest of Donbass will become much harder for Kiev. According to most reporting, the intensity of fighting along the Pokrovsk axis hasn't abated since the Kursk operation began. That could indicate the Kremlin still believes the war will be decided in the Donbass and that redeploying troops from there to protect Kursk will be playing into Kiev's hands. Now, that's not to say such a scenario won't unfold in the coming days. Analyst Emil Kostelny has written that a best-case scenario for Ukraine might go something like this. Quoting, "Russia decides it's not acceptable to leave any areas to Ukrainian hands and will divert significant resources, even from the most critical places, to get every square kilometer back despite the losses." Still, we shouldn't assume that Putin will be so eager to dance to Zelensky's tune. Nor is the lack of impact on the Pokrovsk front the only potential downside to the incursion. There's also the issue of manpower. Due to political shenanigans, Kiev only passed a much-needed mobilization bill this spring, about 6 months after the previous overall commander, Valery Zaluzhny, requested it. As a result, Ukraine's armed forces are now severely short on manpower. While the situation is expected to improve over the autumn, the fact is that Kiev currently can't afford to lose too many troops, especially when reserves may need to be rushed to Donbass in case of an emergency. Well, losing troops could be exactly what happens once Russia finally gets its forces together and counterattacks in Kursk. Pasi Paranin of the Black Bird Group open source intelligence agency told AP News that, quote, "The toughest phase of Ukraine's incursion is likely to begin now as Russian reserves enter the fray." Meanwhile, military analyst Konrad Muska cautions that Ukraine could suffer, quote, "huge losses when Russia counterattacks." Then there's the potential for Russia to retaliate in ways that go beyond just trying to retake Kursk Oblast. One costly one that The Economist highlights could be a massive missile attack on the government quarter in Kiev. For now, though, these potential downsides remain mostly hypothetical, which brings us on to the last of our two questions. What will the next phase of the operation look like? On his excellent Substack, Futura Doctrina, Mick Ryan ran through a number of realistic options for Ukraine going forwards. Some risky, some less so. Most risky, in his opinion, was for Ukraine to try and hold all the territory they control right now, to effectively conquer and keep over 1,000 square kilometers of Russia to use as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. This would be risky because, as Ryan writes, this option would, however, demand huge numbers of combat and support troops to defend the seized Russian territory. It would require a significant engineering effort to build minefields and other obstacles, trench lines and deep bunkers, and logistic storage locations. Ukraine probably does not have the forces for long-term occupation of such a large piece of territory. At the other end of the spectrum, Kiev could withdraw its forces completely from Russia in the coming days. This would free up troops to be redeployed to Pokrovsk while still serving as a massive humiliation for Putin. It would also send the message that Ukraine is capable of attacking inside Russian territory at any time. Of course, the downside of a full withdrawal would be the impact on morale. Hence why Ryan thinks another option is more likely, consolidating the most defensible terrain. In this scenario, Ukraine stops trying to press forward and instead retreats back to the parts of Kursk that will be easiest to hold against Russian counterattack. This would still free up some troops, since it would require fewer men to hold, while also meaning Kiev could retain a bargaining chip for use in future negotiations. And negotiations seem to be at the forefront of everyone's minds, especially as the American election approaches. As the New York Times writes, Trump has suggested that if he wins this year's election, he will force Ukraine to work out a peace deal with Russia. That would likely require Ukraine to give up most or all of the territory that Russia currently holds. Should this happen, then Ukraine will desperately want to have a chunk of prime Russian real estate in its back pocket that it can trade for some of its own land. The southwest of Kursk Oblast, with its vital gas pumping station, would fit the bill perfectly. All this, of course, assumes that the Kremlin reacts as we expect it to. It's possible that Moscow might unleash its own surprises. Emil Kostelny has suggested that one unlikely but worrying scenario could see Russia essentially write off the occupied parts of Kursk, sending just enough troops to freeze the front, but otherwise continuing to focus all of its resources on the Donbass. This would leave Ukraine with a huge slice of territory, but also the headache of defending it. As Kostelny writes, quoting, Ukrainian forces would be tied to guard and hold an expanded secondary direction, while the fight in Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, and Kharkiv would continue just as intensively. At the time of writing, that seems unlikely. Just as we were completing this piece on August the 14th, the Wall Street Journal reported that US intelligence has evidence of Moscow redeploying its troops from inside Ukraine to defend Kursk. Exactly how big the redeployment is, well, that's currently unknown. So that's all we know so far about the Kursk offensive, both the biggest surprise and likely the biggest gamble seen in this war since Wagner's aborted march on Moscow. How this gamble will play out in the long term is still a mystery. It could be that Ukraine overextends itself and loses vital manpower in the Russian counterattack. It could be that Kiev's forces manage to consolidate and wind up holding a chunk of Russia for the foreseeable future. Or Ukraine may double down and launch an equally impressive incursion into Belgorod, or make a mad dash for the Kursk nuclear power plant, or something else utterly audacious. At this stage, we simply don't know. It may be that when the history books are written, the Kursk operation will be seen as a game changer, or it may be just yet another twist in this most dramatic of wars. Just another step in a long saga leading to one side's eventual victory. Either way, things will probably become clearer in the next few days. For now, though, the Kursk gamble remains just that, a bold gambit, both high risk and high reward, one that has so far managed to shake up perceptions of the war across the world. Only time will tell if rolling the dice in such a dramatic fashion was worth it, whether the Kursk operation will be remembered as lunacy or as a Ukrainian masterstroke.